Hey everyone, today we've got a tricky little entry table build that turned out better than I even expected. Stay tuned. In most of my builds, clients will have a general idea of what they're looking for in the piece, whether that's style, size, or material, what have you. Now this one was really no different, but something that I like to do for pretty much all my builds is try to make it unique to the client, whether that's a little detail, or even just a finish type, or something to make it unique and a truly custom piece for them. This piece was no different, and we were able to add some cool details to it. But for now, just like every other project, we start off with milling our lumber. So that includes jointing, which I did off camera, then moving on to the planer where we are going to find our final thickness, and now onto the table saw where you're going to see me ripping our boards down to their final width. Now this table is going to have 3 shelves, and I actually left these just a little bit oversized for a reason that you'll see a little bit later on. Laying out this plastic always seems to get the better of me, but it really does go a long way in helping me keep my workbench clean and free from the glue drips that happen during the process of the glue up. Something you might notice throughout this build is that the miter station behind me is kind of changing the entire time. So right now it doesn't have any doors or anything of the sort, but by the end I think we'll have some doors and some finish put on it, so you'll get to kind of keep an eye on that progress as we go on throughout this build as a little bit of a bonus for you. This first glue up went really smoothly, and you'll actually notice that there's glue squeezed out on both the top and the bottom of our panel here, and that's just a good indicator that we have glue penetrating that whole joint. After completing this glue up and the other 2 shelf panel glue ups, it was time to move on to the real work on these shelf panels. I left these panels a little bit wider than their final width because I actually needed that space to drill out some recesses for the legs. So as you'll see in the sketch, each one of the legs will be recessed into the side of the shelf. You might have noticed in that sketch that the end of these shelves are going to be curved, and there's going to be 6 legs total. We'll cut the curved ends on these shelves later on, but for now I left these panels a little bit oversized so that I'd have some meat to grab into when I'm drilling out these holes for the leg recesses. The process of marking out the location of all those leg recesses was actually a little bit complicated, and I'm not sure if I could explain it well. Plus it's super boring to watch, so I'm just going to skip forward past that and show you the footage of me trimming it down to its final width. After getting our panels cut down to their final width, our next step is to cut the curves on all these shelves, but first I wanted to get them kind of cleaned up a little bit, sanded down, and any imperfections filled. What you'll see me using here is the Starbond thick black CA glue, along with the thin clear CA glue and accelerator, in order to fill all those little imperfections. The reason I like using these Starbond CA glue products is because they dry in a matter of seconds with the paired accelerator spray, and overall they do a nice job of filling the knots without making it an eyesore or drawing too much undue attention to it. With all the imperfections filled and the panels sanded to a rough 80 grit, it was time to cut down the curved ends on all of our shelves. If you've never seen a circle jig like this used before, all I'm doing is marking out the radius of my circle on the jig itself, and then marking out the point from which I'll take that radius and cut it onto my panel. After drilling a small hole on the bottom of my shelf, I'm able to attach that jig to the panel itself, and then I'm ready to start cutting. This required multiple passes to get through as the router can't handle the full inch of material all at once, so I go through and take multiple passes and then use a sacrificial board that you see at the bottom there, so that when I get to my bottom piece I can cut right into that sacrificial board and leave a nice clean cut on the bottom of my shelf. With the arcs cut on all the shelves, it was time to set those aside for a moment and focus our attention onto the base of the entry table. So see the sketch here and the kind of general idea of what we're going for, and the first step was to cut down the lumber for our legs. Now we're going to use a jig on the table saw to get these squares down to actual circles for our leg, but before doing that I want to get the dowels drilled for our joinery when we eventually assemble the base. So what you'll see there is I marked out a reference stick, I guess you would call it, and the thought behind doing that is basically just to remove any potential error in measurement out of the whole equation, so I'm just using one reference so that these lines should be exactly the same. With all of our measurements made, it was time to move on to the dowel jig here, and you'll notice that most of these pieces have the corners ripped down at a 45-degree angle. And I did this on purpose, but I did it definitely probably a little bit too early. Would have been easier had I waited until I was done drilling these dowels. But that's just to make it a little bit easier on my table saw as we get into actually using our jig. If you're a little bit confused about how we're going to use a table saw to make dowels, that's definitely probably understandable, but it should make sense here in just a minute. So this is the jig that we're going to use, but first we need to prep the wood so that it can actually be used by this jig. Now I won't get too far into the details of how this jig works, but thanks to YouTube I was able to figure it out and get it made. But essentially we're going to put this piece of wood onto the jig and then use a cordless drill to spin it, and as it spins it'll go up against the table saw into the blade, creating, in theory, a perfect circle. It definitely felt a little bit scary doing this the first time, but it actually worked surprisingly smoothly. The only caveat with that is that it created a ton of dust. So you'll see that I tried to set up even my extra shop vac to help with some of that dust collection, but it did nothing. It was just everywhere. Despite that one drawback, the jig worked out really great and we got 6 identical dowels. But if you didn't believe me about the dust that it created, this is just after creating 2 dowels, so you can imagine what all 6 made my shop look like. After getting all the dowels cut, I decided I might as well go ahead and sand them while I was at it and had the jig out, which was actually very convenient to use. So I went through all the grits, and before I got to my final grit, I did what's called water popping, which is basically just a method of exposing the wood grain to moisture so that it'll rise up and then you can knock it down with your last coat of sanding, leaving a much smoother finish. Here is one more low quality sketch, and this shows the supports that are going to go in between the legs that we've already finished making and go underneath the shelves for our entry table. I cut the pieces down to their final width and length, and then off camera I cut the same dowel joinery that we used earlier to the ends of all these pieces for our final glue up assembly. I'm going to be using what's called a half lap joint for the base of this frame, and basically all I'm doing here is, after measuring out all of my cut marks, is cutting away half of that material so that both the pieces can merge together and sit up against each other smoothly. Normally I try to plan out every element of the build before I even start cutting any of the wood so that I kind of know what I'm getting into, but this one I totally dropped the ball and forgot about the fact that I'd be joining a round object in the legs to a square object in the supports going underneath the shelves. So what you'll see me doing here is I whipped up a quick little jig for my trim router to cut the recesses for the support pieces to kind of nestle into the round legs. So definitely far from a perfect solution for this, and I'd probably do it, well, not probably, I would do it very differently going back, but it ended up working out, and we're ready to move on to our dry fit here. So this is just a dry fit to kind of test to make sure that everything is lining up as it should, and as you can see here, a couple of them didn't quite line up perfectly. So I just went back through and kind of marked out the spots that needed to be adjusted a little bit, and took it over to my chisel on the assembly table and just cleaned up those cuts a little bit to make the joints fit together properly. This is a great example of why dry fitting your joints before any glue up is super crucial, because without this I would have been in a very tough spot with glue on the piece and joints that did not fit at all. With all the joints fitted properly, it was time to move on to sanding the individual components to save myself some time and hassle later on when the piece was already glued up. Now, glue ups can be a little bit stressful because you only have so much open time on the glue before it starts to set on you. So what I opted to do in this project is actually do the glue ups in a series of different stages. The first stage is the 2 sets of legs with the horizontal stretchers going in between them, and because I did the glue ups in separate stages, I was able to focus on getting nice tight joints and keeping it square throughout the entire process. While multiple glue ups are nice for quality, at about this point the project I was getting pretty sick of gluing things up and definitely ready to move on to the final finishing stages of the project. But one thing that I did do on this glue up is that I actually taped the joint to prevent the glue squeeze out from getting all over the finished piece. So some forward thinking there that I didn't do on the other ones, which definitely helped me out. Moving on to sanding the shelf tops, I went all the way from 80 grit up to 180 grit, which is the maximum grit for the finish that I'll be using here, which is Rubio Monocoat. After getting these shelf tops sanded up to 180, it was time to add an edge profile to the shelves. I typically gravitate towards this Diablo 1/8 inch roundover bit for my edge profiles simply because it just creates a clean, consistent finish to the edge of a piece. So as opposed to hand sanding where it can get a little bit wavy if you're not really careful, this creates an edge profile that's essentially perfect throughout the entire length of the piece and gives it a much more professional, high quality look. For these leg recessed areas where I couldn't use the actual roundover bit, I went back by hand and just softened those edges to match the edge profile of the rest of the shelf. With the sanding on the shelves done, there's only 2 more steps to go before putting on our finish. On almost all my pieces, I put some sort of leg leveler or foot pad to prevent any scratching of the client's floors after they get the piece into their home. Those felt pads will be installed later after we get our finish applied. The method that we'll be using to attach the base to the shelves is threaded inserts. So what you'll see me doing here is drilling out basically oversized holes so that the bolts will be able to go through that hole eventually and screw into the threaded inserts that we're about to install in the bottom of our shelves. After lining up the shelves in their final resting place, I went ahead and marked through the holes onto the bottom of the shelves where we're going to need the locations of our threaded inserts. This part of the build always makes me a little bit nervous because I have actually accidentally drilled through a tabletop when trying to drill out the holes for my threaded inserts. So I try to pay special attention, especially in these situations where I don't have much clearance, and try not to do that again because that is actually a nightmare. You might be wondering why I don't just use screws as opposed to going through the whole hassle of this threaded insert process. And the reason for that is wood movement. Throughout the year, wood will expand and contract as humidity rises and falls. So these threaded inserts and the oversized holes that you saw me drill a little bit earlier actually allow the piece to move a little bit throughout these seasons and prevent any splitting or cracking throughout the course of its life. Rubio Monocoat, the finish that I'm going to be using for this piece, is pretty hard to mess up, but one thing that can mess it up is by leaving too much sawdust on the piece. So what you'll see me doing here is wiping the whole thing down with mineral spirits to get any last little bits of dust off the piece. I needed to change the tone of this white oak just a little bit in order to meet the client's request, so rather than using Rubio Monocoat Pure, which is my typical go-to finish, I use their mist color. At about $60 per can, Rubio is not a very cheap finish at first glance, but actually when you consider the fact that you only need 1 coat and very, very minimal tools to apply, I've found that it actually ends up being one of the cheapest options that you have for any type of wood finishing. Despite the relative affordability, I would still be choosing Rubio even if it was 10 times more, because I really do love the finished product and the application process. So after troweling it on with the yellow spreader there, you see me buffing it in with just a white 3M buff pad, and that's just to ensure even coverage before coming back in with the cotton terry cloths and removing any of that excess finish. The base was a little bit too tall for me to comfortably finish it on my workbench, so I ended up just doing the rest of that on the floor using the same processes that I showed on the shelf tops. With the finish applied to the whole piece and looking great, I was able to install the bottom 2 shelves of the entry table and glue on that 6th and final leg. With that last glue up completed, the final step was to go back through and add in our recessed felt feet. This project pushed me out of my comfort zone in a lot of different ways, but I think by the end of it I learned a lot of great skills and was able to deliver a pretty awesome piece to the client. So as we get in here into our final beauty shots of the piece, I'd like to thank you guys all for watching. And if you enjoyed the video at all, you should definitely consider subscribing because this is my first video on YouTube, and presumably I will only be getting better at this. So thanks again for watching. See you next time.